Welcome to BeFrightened. We tell stories that will keep you up or help you sleep at night. I used to love the library on our campus in Boston. It was my go-to spot when I needed to escape the chaos of college life and get some serious work done. The library was a refuge from the noise of student activities and the constant hustle of city life. I'd spend hours there, especially during finals, trying to keep up with my coursework and research. There was something comforting about the familiar routine, finding a quiet corner, setting up my books and laptop, and immersing myself in my studies. At first, everything seemed normal. The library was always busy, with students hunched over laptops, scribbling notes, and frantically typing away. I was just one of many, another face in the crowd, but as the semester wore on, I began to notice him. He was always there, just another student who seemed to be pulling long hours like the rest of us. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Everyone was a little stressed during final season, but soon, it became clear that he always chose a seat where he could watch me. Whenever I looked up, I'd find him glancing over his book at me, just sitting there with a friendly smile that didn't seem to fade. The first time I really noticed him was during a late-night study session. I'd been at the library for hours, buried in my thesis research. As I stretched my legs and rubbed my tired eyes, I noticed him sitting at a table diagonally across from mine. His eyes met mine briefly, and he gave me a nod before returning to his laptop. It seemed innocuous at first, just another student acknowledging my presence. But over the next few days, I realized he was always there, no matter what time I arrived or where I chose to sit. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just paranoia from too much caffeine and too little sleep. Everyone's a little on edge during finals. But then things started to get strange. One day, I walked into the library and found my favorite pen, the one I'd lost weeks ago, sitting right in the middle of my usual table. Next to it was a note saying he'd found it for me. It gave me an uneasy feeling. How did he know it was my pen? It felt too personal. Too intentional. That pen was a gift from my grandmother, and seeing it suddenly reappear felt like more than a coincidence. I decided to change my routine. I started choosing different times to study and picking random spots in the library, hoping to avoid him. But it didn't matter. No matter where I sat, he always seemed to find me, hovering just at the edge of my vision. It got to the point where I couldn't focus on anything else, always wondering when he'd pop up again. Even outside the library, I'd see him around campus, always with that same smile. It was like he was everywhere, always watching. I'd catch glimpses of him in the cafeteria, across the quad, even in the gym. His presence was pervasive, and it felt like there was no escaping it. The turning point came one late night when the library was nearly empty. I had stayed late, hoping to finish a paper. I stepped out to use the bathroom, and when I came back, my laptop was open. I knew I'd closed it before I left. On the screen was a document detailing my daily schedule and a creepy note about how we were meant to be together. My heart raced and panic set in. I grabbed my things and left, not stopping until I was safely back in my dorm room. I didn't know what to do. I thought about going to campus security, but what proof did I have? He hadn't technically done anything wrong, but the whole situation felt off. I spent the night tossing and turning, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. By the next morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't keep living in fear. I had to confront the situation, even if it meant facing him directly. The next day, I went back to the library, trying to act normal. I sat at my usual table and pretended to study, but he didn't show up for hours. Just when I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number telling me to look under my chair. I reached down, and my fingers brushed against something solid. Panic set in. I pulled out a leather-bound journal. It was his. Inside, it was filled with notes about me, including a picture of me sleeping in my own bed. At the bottom of the page was a note about us being together forever. That's when I knew I couldn't handle this alone. I headed straight to the campus police and reported everything. They took the journal as evidence and promised to investigate. Sitting in that small office, recounting every strange encounter, I felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief that I was finally doing something about it, but fear of what might happen next. That was 2 years ago. I've graduated and moved to a new city, but I still get anxious when I see unknown numbers pop up on my phone. With my current remote work, I either work from home or choose bustling coffee shops and crowded places where I feel more secure rather than working at my local library. The police never found enough evidence to charge him, and last I heard, he'd left the university too. I just hope he hasn't found someone else to target. Trading city life for a coastal town seemed like a dream. The idea of swapping honking horns and exhaust fumes for the sound of waves and fresh ocean air was irresistible. I moved to Santa Cruz, a lively town known for its vibrant boardwalk and laid-back vibe. The transition felt like stepping into another world that promised peace and a slower pace of life. At first, everything was perfect. I enjoyed my mornings at the beach and quiet evenings at home. The sound of the ocean was supposed to be calming, but I quickly learned that even paradise has its darkness. After about a month in Santa Cruz, things began to feel off. It started with small annoyances. I'd come home to find a window open that I was sure I'd closed, or I'd spend an hour sweeping sand out of the house, only to find more the next morning. Initially, I blamed it on living near the beach. Sand gets everywhere, I thought. It was just part of the charm, nothing to worry about. But then other things started happening. Sometimes the house smelled faintly of seaweed, even when I hadn't been to the beach in days. My belongings never seemed to be where I left them, always slightly moved or out of place. I tried to rationalize it. New house, new routines. I was probably just being forgetful. But a nagging feeling kept bothering me, a sense that I wasn't alone. One night, I woke up to a noise downstairs. Probably just the wind, I thought. But as I lay there in the dark, I heard it again. A soft knock, like someone trying to move quietly, but bumping into things. I got up, grabbed my phone, and crept down the stairs. As I reached the bottom step, I noticed wet footprints leading from the front door to the stairs. My heart pounded in my chest. Was someone else in my house? I wasn't going to stay to find out. I slipped on a jacket and ran out the door, heading straight for the 24-hour diner down the street. The waitress took one look at me, her eyes widening with concern, and asked if everything was all right. I told her what happened, my voice shaky and uneven. The waitress listened as I explained what had happened, and she nodded thoughtfully. She mentioned that these old beach houses often have quirks. The salty air can make doors swell and stick, and the coastal winds sometimes cause the windows and floors to creak, making unsettling noises at night. She also noted that some locals aren't always welcoming to newcomers. It wasn't unusual for a few residents to play pranks or use shortcuts through private yards, especially after dark. While it was mostly harmless, it could be unsettling for someone not used to it. She suggested reaching out to neighbors to see if they had noticed anything similar, and reassured me that it was important to speak up if anything felt truly off. As for the footprints and noises, she mentioned that it wasn't uncommon for some people to take advantage of unoccupied homes, especially as the seasons changed. With the town attracting many tourists, there were often vacation homes left empty for weeks at a time, making them tempting spots for those in need of temporary shelter. She suggested keeping an eye out for any signs of forced entry or unusual activity around the neighborhood. Her explanations made sense, and I wanted to believe her, but they didn't entirely ease my mind. As the sun came up, I walked back home, thinking over what she'd said. The house looked peaceful in the morning light, but now I saw it differently. Old, with potential hiding spots and entry points I hadn't considered before. For the next few days, I was on edge. I checked all the windows and doors, finding a couple that didn't latch properly. I fixed them, but it didn't help much. I knew there could be other ways in that I hadn't found yet. I tried talking to the local police, but they seemed unconcerned. They told me to document any suspicious activity and call immediately if I felt threatened. I felt a bit dismissed, but knew they were just doing their job with the information they had. A few weeks passed without incident, but small things kept bothering me. Items seemed to have moved slightly, and I started to doubt my own memory. Was I imagining things, or was someone really coming into my house when I wasn't there? I decided to have security cameras installed around the house. I needed proof of what was happening and hoped the cameras would catch any unwanted visitors in the act. Then, one evening as I walked home from the beach, I saw someone standing in front of my house, just staring at it. When they saw me, they quickly walked away, disappearing around the corner. I hurried inside and locked the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Around 3 a.m. that night, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open a window. I froze, trying to stay as quiet as possible, unsure of what to do next. Should I call the police? Confront the intruder? As I debated my next move, I heard footsteps downstairs. They were slow and deliberate, like someone taking their time to look around. I grabbed my phone and locked myself in the bathroom, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. As I whispered my location to the operator, I heard the stairs creaking. The footsteps were coming closer, each one amplifying my fear. The police arrived within minutes, lights flashing and sirens blaring. By the time I unlocked the bathroom door, they were already searching the house. They found signs of entry, but no intruder. Whoever it was had managed to leave without a trace by the time help arrived. After reviewing the security footage on site, the officers confirmed that someone had been inside. They took a copy of the footage for further analysis at the station, promising to keep me updated on any developments. A week later, I got a call from the police station. They had analyzed the footage more thoroughly and identified the intruder. The officer explained that while the initial review showed someone entering, the quality wasn't clear enough to identify them. Upon closer inspection, they enhanced the footage, revealing enough detail for facial recognition software to make a match. To my shock, it was my ex from the city. I had moved to Santa Cruz to get away from him, never imagining he would follow me. He'd been staying in a nearby Airbnb, blending in with the tourist crowd, and had been watching me for weeks, learning my routines and waiting for the right moment to break in. The police arrested him, but the damage was done. The tranquility I had hoped to find in Santa Cruz was shattered. I had moved here seeking solace and a fresh start, but now it felt as if the peace I longed for was just an illusion. Now, I'm more cautious. I make sure to double-check the locks and keep a light on at night. Despite what happened, I refuse to let fear push me out of Santa Cruz. I'm determined to stay and make it the peaceful place I envisioned when I first arrived. At first, my new job felt like a dream come true. I had landed a coveted position at a tech firm in Seattle, and the view from my high-rise office was stunning. I won't name names, but I am sure everyone knows the firm. On clear days, I could see the Space Needle and the bustling city below, but 3 months in, the thrill was overshadowed by a creeping unease. I found myself too busy watching my back to enjoy the scenery. It began with small, seemingly innocuous incidents. I'd come in to find items on my desk out of place, and my computer would be logged in when I was sure I'd shut it down. Initially, I blamed it on the cleaning staff or my own forgetfulness. Then the emails started. They all came from an anonymous Gmail account. The first one seemed harmless, mentioning the latte I'd had that morning. I dismissed it as spam and deleted it, but the messages kept coming, each one more personal than the last. They knew what I'd worn, who I'd had lunch with, and even what I'd said on phone calls I thought were private. Looking back, I should have reported it sooner, but I hesitated. Who wants to be the new employee making a fuss over a few odd emails? It wasn't until I noticed someone had accessed my personal email account through my work computer that I finally spoke up. I went to my boss and explained the situation. He said he'd talk to IT about improving security. That weekend, I got another email. This one accused me of not being a team player for telling my boss. How did they know I'd talked to him? The next week, with everything that had been happening, I couldn't help but wonder if I was being observed. Every time someone looked my way, I wondered if they were the one. I started mixing up my daily activities, but the emails kept coming. One of them suggested I take a day off, mentioning that I seemed overly stressed. Well, I took the advice and called in sick the next day. As I sat in my apartment, I realized I couldn't live like this. I had to find out who was behind it all. That's when I remembered the IT manager had installed remote access software on my computer in my first week. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. Could this be how someone was spying on me? I didn't know enough about computers to investigate it myself, but I knew I needed help. I considered contacting an outside IT specialist, or maybe even a private investigator, but I thought that bringing in an outsider could make things worse if the stalker found out. I felt stuck, unsure of my next move. That evening, I tried to find resources on cybersecurity and how to protect myself from digital threats. Most of the advice was too technical for me to follow, which only added to my frustration. The next day at the office, I paid more attention to my surroundings. I noticed the IT manager making his rounds, stopping at various desks longer than usual. When he reached my area, he lingered nearby, glancing my way often. Another email arrived, mentioning details about a call I'd had on my work phone the previous evening. I'd taken the company phone home, thinking it was secure. It hit me that the stalker's reach extended beyond the office walls, into what I thought were private conversations. Later, the IT manager came to my desk and accessed my computer directly, mentioning something about a security update. I couldn't follow what he was doing, but watching him work on my machine made me feel uneasy. I stayed late, using work as an excuse. Once alone, I tried to figure out if anything on my computer could show who had been accessing it. But after fumbling through menus and settings that I didn't understand, I realized I was out of my depth. As I was leaving, I noticed the IT manager's computer was still on. The screen showed something that caught my eye, a list of employee names, including mine. Next to each name were notes with personal details that shouldn't have been in a work-related document. I leaned in closer to have a look. There were comments about recent conversations I'd had, such as my plans for the weekend and the fact that I'd called in sick recently. Next to a colleague's name, I saw a note about their child's school activities. There were things mentioned that wouldn't have been discussed between colleagues, too personal, too intimate. This wasn't just about me. It was clear that the IT manager was collecting personal information on multiple employees. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They had access to everything: our emails, our conversations, and possibly even our movements. The anonymous emails I had been receiving were likely just one aspect of a much larger invasion of privacy. The next morning, I forced myself to go to work. Hiding at home wouldn't solve anything, and I needed to gather more information. At the office, I paid close attention to the IT manager's movements. His routine seemed normal on the surface, but I noticed how often he accessed people's computers. He always had a plausible explanation ready. During lunch, I overheard two colleagues discussing unusual emails they'd received. It confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't isolated to me. I spent the afternoon documenting everything suspicious I'd noticed. The list grew longer than I expected, but it was all circumstantial. I needed concrete proof. As I was packing up to leave, the IT manager approached my desk. He mentioned noticing some unusual activity on my computer and offered to take a look. I made an excuse about a deadline and left quickly. On my commute home, I weighed my options. I couldn't handle this alone, but I wasn't sure who to turn to. The police would dismiss it without hard evidence. A private investigator could be expensive and might alert them. At home, I double-checked my locks and drew the curtains. As I was about to go to bed, my work phone beeped. A new email. The sender knew I'd been asking questions. They warned me to stop digging, or things would get uncomfortable. That was it. I couldn't live like this anymore. I decided to take a risk and reach out to one of the colleagues I'd overheard at lunch. Safety in numbers, perhaps. The next day, I arrived at work early and caught her before others arrived. I hesitantly asked about the emails she'd mentioned. We compared notes and realized the scale of what was happening. By lunchtime, we'd discreetly spoken to 5 other co-workers. All had similar stories. We agreed to meet after work to plan our next move. That evening, we gathered at a cafe far from the office. We were no longer alone in this. As we shared our experiences, a plan began to form. We'd document everything, gather evidence, and then present it to the company's senior management as a group. It wouldn't be easy, and it might not work. Within a week, our efforts paid off. We presented our evidence to the company's senior management, who were shocked and took immediate action. The IT manager was fired on the spot and faced criminal charges. Senior management initiated a comprehensive review of the company's security protocols, bringing in external auditors to ensure transparency and accountability. The sense of relief among employees was noticeable, and gradually, the office atmosphere returned to normal. Shopping at the Galleria in Houston used to be my favorite weekend escape. I was drawn to the buzz of shoppers and the allure of high-end stores, even when most of the items were far beyond my price range. As I strolled through the mall one Saturday, I wandered into the LV store, captivated by the luxury and elegance around me. I found myself admiring a particular handbag, its price tag a reminder of my window shopping status. While I examined the handbag, a man walked in, catching my attention with his presence. He was handsome and impeccably dressed, exuding an air of confidence. As he approached, he commented on how perfect the bag would look on me. Before I could respond, he offered to buy it for me in exchange for my phone number. I hesitated, caught off guard by the unexpected offer. The salesperson, sensing a sale, gave me an encouraging nod, as if urging me to say yes. That was the last time I ever took advice from a salesperson. Despite my reservations, I found myself agreeing. A part of me was flattered by the attention, and I convinced myself it was just a harmless encounter. After all, who wouldn't want a free LV bag? Our first date seemed perfect. He took me to an upscale restaurant, and we talked for hours. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my life. I felt like I was in a whirlwind romance, swept off my feet by a man who seemed too good to be true. But as weeks passed, his behavior became more and more unsettling. He started showing up unexpectedly wherever I was. Once, I was at a coffee shop with a friend, and he appeared out of nowhere, claiming it was a coincidence. He knew details about my schedule that I hadn't shared with him. The more he inserted himself into my life, the more uneasy I felt. The turning point came when he mentioned a conversation I'd had with a friend, one I was certain I hadn't told him about. It was as if he had been listening in on my private conversations, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to create some distance, hoping he would take the hint. But he persisted. Gifts began arriving at my door: flowers, jewelry, and designer clothes. He even showed up at my workplace unannounced, leaving my coworkers whispering and speculating. His actions, while seemingly romantic, made me increasingly uncomfortable. It felt like I was living in a movie, but the genre had shifted from romance to thriller. The gifts and attention were overwhelming, and I knew I had to end things. When I finally broke it off, his demeanor changed completely. The calls and texts became relentless, often late at night. I'd spot his Mercedes parked on my street at odd hours, headlights illuminating my window like a spotlight. The situation escalated when I came home one day to find my apartment had been entered. Nothing was stolen, but on my bed was a gift box with another designer handbag inside. A note implied he was always watching over me and looking after me. The police said they couldn't do much without concrete evidence of a threat. I felt exposed and vulnerable, trapped in a situation I couldn't control. Desperate to regain some sense of security, I started keeping track of everything. I took photos, saved messages, and set up security cameras around my apartment. My life became a constant state of alertness. Every noise in the night made my heart race. The expensive gifts kept coming, delivered by courier. It was as if he knew about my increased security measures and was taunting me, daring me to catch him in the act. I limited my outings and varied my routes, hoping to evade his watchful eye. Friends and family urged me to move or change my number, but I was determined not to let him mess with my life in Houston. My closest friend, Kathy, was my lifeline during this time. She called daily, offering support and reminding me that I wasn't alone in this. Then one day, it all stopped. The calls, the texts, the gifts, everything went silent. The sudden quiet was disconcerting, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next move. Part of me hoped he had finally moved on, while another part worried he was just planning something more sinister. That handbag still sits in my closet, a reminder of my lapse in judgment and the nightmare that followed. I've considered getting rid of it, but part of me fears that doing so might provoke him. Sometime later, I received a friend request on Facebook from someone I didn't recognize. Their profile picture was that of the LV store at the Galleria. I didn't accept or decline, unsure of what either action might trigger. Occasionally, my phone rings with no caller ID. When I answer, there's only silence, but I can hear steady breathing on the other end. I wonder if it's him or just a prank, but the unease lingers. And the most disturbing part of it all, a small part of me almost misses the attention. This realization frightens me more than anything else, a reminder of how deeply his presence affected me. Years have passed since, and thankfully, I haven't heard anything more from him. I've moved on, but the memory remains. Every time I pass by the LV store at the Galleria, I feel a mix of nostalgia and dread, a reminder of a moment when luxury turned into a nightmare. This chapter of my life is closed now, but it opened my eyes to the hidden dangers behind seemingly innocent encounters. The world might be full of beautiful things, but not all that glitters is gold. Ultimately, I realized that true security is found within, and that peace of mind is the most valuable possession. I had thought moving to the quiet suburb of Fairview would offer the quiet that I had been looking for. The peaceful streets and friendly neighbors felt welcoming when I first arrived. However, it wasn't long before I began to feel uneasy in what was supposed to be my safe haven. The neighbors were all friendly, but the old guy next door stood out. He was always in his yard, ready with a wave and a smile. At first it seemed charming, but I quickly noticed how often he was there, watching me. About a month after settling in, I started noticing things. He was always outside when I left for work. Initially, I thought it was just a coincidence, or that he was an early riser. But he was there in the evenings too, no matter when I came home. Somehow, we always ended up at the grocery store at the same time. He'd appear at the end of an aisle, striking up a conversation, asking about my day in a way that felt too knowing. I know it sounds harmless and sweet, and at the time it felt that way, but something about his constant presence unsettled me. One Saturday morning, I was in my backyard, trying to enjoy my coffee in peace. My neighbor called out over the fence, mentioning how he hadn't seen my car in the driveway the night before. I tried to dismiss the feeling, but it weighed on my mind. One evening, after he casually mentioned details from a private conversation I'd had with a friend on my patio, my unease grew. I began to take note of our interactions, writing them down in a journal whenever something felt off, hoping to understand if there was a pattern. As I noted each instance, it became increasingly clear. His presence was no coincidence. When I returned home one night, I found him waiting by my door, looking concerned. He claimed he'd seen someone lurking around my house and suggested I be more careful about my security. The way he said it felt more like a threat than friendly advice. That night, I had trouble sleeping. As I lay in bed, the usual sounds of the house seemed unnaturally loud, feeding my anxiety. I replayed every interaction with him in my head, questioning my own judgment. Was this paranoia, or was something truly wrong? In the middle of the night, I hear a noise outside. Creeping to the window, I see a figure in his yard, adjusting something on a tree facing my house. A camera. Panic sets in as I realize the extent of his invasion. This isn't just harmless watching, it's a violation. I'd had enough. The next morning, I went over to his house, determined to confront him. As I raised my hand to knock, I hesitated for a moment. I knocked. The door just opened, and there he stood, smiling as if he was expecting me. He invited me in for coffee, acting as if this was just another neighborly visit. His house was meticulously organized. Every surface was spotless. As we sat in his kitchen, I noticed a wall filled with framed photos. Many of them were of a younger woman who looked strangely familiar. As I glanced at the photos, he began talking about his late wife, who had passed away a few years ago. He mentioned how I reminded him of her, how my mannerisms and appearance brought back fond memories. Finally, I confronted him about his constant presence and his knowledge of my life. His smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. He explained that he had felt a connection because I reminded him of his late wife. He thought he was protecting me, keeping an eye out as he had for her. The intensity of his gaze made me nervous. I was stunned. He spoke so casually about invading my privacy, as if it were perfectly normal. When I pressed him further, he became defensive, insisting he meant no harm. Back home, I decided to take action. I contacted a close friend and shared everything that had been happening, making sure someone knew about the situation. Together, we devised a plan to keep him at a distance and monitor his actions discreetly. After all, he hadn't done anything that would yet be considered crossing a line. The neighbor seemed to retreat into his own world after our confrontation, no longer appearing outside as frequently. As time passed, the tension slowly began to dissipate. With the support of friends, I regained a sense of safety. Still, the whole experience made me feel uncomfortable, but I also felt sorry for the old man. Life in Fairview has moved on since, and we are still neighbors, but thankfully his presence has faded into the background. We remain neighborly, exchanging polite nods when we cross paths, but there's an unspoken understanding to keep our distance. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback, feel free to leave it in the comments below. If you have a story you'd like to share or need to contact us for any reason, you'll find our email address in the video description.